By the time Detective Geathers identified George Henday as the man behind the park executions, New York City had already been terrorized by a killer who calmly hunted couples in darkness, blew apart their heads at close range, and arranged their corpses afterward while blood still poured from the wounds. 4 people were already dead. 2 men had their skulls shattered so violently that bone fragments and brain matter were sprayed across park grounds and nearby walkways. 2 women were forced to witness those executions before bullets tore through their own faces seconds later. The killer left handwritten notes beside every body, stood calmly in the blood afterward, and disappeared into the city each time without witnesses, fingerprints, or surveillance images. By then, the investigation had uncovered something even more disturbing. The killer was not selecting victims randomly. He was watching people first, studying them, judging them, following them quietly through parks until he decided they deserved to die. Detective Geathers. Once George Henday became the prime suspect, how did the investigation stop him before more bodies appeared?
By the time George Henday's name surfaced, the city already felt poisoned. Detectives were reviewing photographs every night showing catastrophic head wounds, exploded skulls, and victims collapsed beside one another in pools of blood while handwritten notes sat neatly beside their bodies. Patrol units flooded public parks after dark because nobody knew where the killer would appear next. Couples were terrified. Every isolated pathway, every parked car near wooded areas, every bench hidden beneath trees suddenly felt dangerous because we understood something deeply disturbing by then. The murders were beginning long before the shootings. George Henday was studying people first. That was what made the investigation psychologically terrifying. We found notebooks inside his apartment filled with observations about strangers. Not names initially. Behaviors. Couples kissing in secluded areas. Married people meeting secretly. Men lying on telephones to spouses. Women touching other men intimately in public places. He cataloged moments quietly and obsessively. Some of those observations matched details tied directly to the murder victims. One woman's scarf. One victim's habit of pacing while speaking on his phone. George Henday had been watching them for days, possibly weeks, before ever approaching them with a weapon. That realization infected the task force immediately, because it meant while we were still processing the blood and tissue from previous scenes, George Henday was already somewhere else in the city, silently selecting more people. The notebook confirmed something else that frightened me even more. He did not hate the victims personally. They barely existed to him as human beings. What mattered to him was what they represented. He believed he was witnessing moral corruption in public spaces and quietly assigning punishment to it. The handwritten notes beside the bodies were not random staging anymore. They were explanations in his own mind. The killings were justified to him before they ever happened. And killers who believe they are morally justified rarely stop voluntarily. The final pages of the notebook became critical because they contained another location and another date, another park, another couple described in detail. That changed the investigation immediately, from analysis to prevention. We were no longer trying to understand George Henday psychologically. We were trying to stop him before another pair of bodies appeared with their heads destroyed beside another handwritten note. We positioned undercover officers throughout Sunken Meadow Park because the notebook strongly suggested that location was next. The park itself was psychologically unsettling at night. Long isolated walkways, dense shadows between trees. Sections quiet enough that gunshots could collapse into the darkness before nearby people understood what they heard. It looked exactly like the environments from the previous murders. George Henda preferred places where couples believed privacy protected them. The operation stretched deep into the night. Detectives moved quietly through the park, while undercover officers watched couples from a distance, hoping George Henda would surface before he acted. That was the disturbing reality of the situation. We were effectively waiting for a predator to emerge, while ordinary people unknowingly continued walking through the environment he preferred hunting in. At first, we saw nothing. That actually bothered me because places like that are never truly empty at night. They feel empty, but they are occupied by people hidden inside shadows, parked cars, pathways, or wooded areas. The danger in parks after midnight is not the darkness itself. It is the fact you rarely know who else is standing inside it watching. Then we saw him. George Henda was standing near a pathway, partially hidden by trees, watching a couple. He was not watching them casually. He was focused completely on their interaction, their movements, their physical contact, the same behavior patterns we later found throughout his notebooks. He looked calm, motionless, patient. That was what disturbed me most when I first saw him in person. He did not look agitated. He looked comfortable. That meant the murders had become normal to him emotionally. We moved carefully because interruption changes behavior in men like that. A killer driven by moral obsession does not suddenly stop once confronted. He adjusts. We understood that approaching him too aggressively might force him toward the couple before we could fully contain the situation. So we closed in slowly. Death was standing less than 50 feet away watching them. When we finally announced ourselves, George Henda turned immediately toward us. What stayed with me afterward was the complete absence of panic in his face. No surprise, no fear, no confusion, just recognition. It looked like he understood instantly that something had entered the structure of what he believed he was supposed to do. Then he moved. That was the moment the entire investigation crystallized for me psychologically, because it proved something horrifying. I fired before he reached them. The round struck him and dropped him before he could fully raise the weapon. He survived and was taken into custody alive. But what disturbed me afterward was how calm he remained even then. No screaming, no emotional collapse, no explanation, no apology. And during the entire interrogation process, George Henda never spoke once. Not one word. At first, detectives found that unusual, but eventually I realized it actually fit the murders perfectly. He believed he had already explained himself through the crime scenes, through the notes, through the bodies, through the positioning of the victims after death. Those handwritten messages left beside people with catastrophic head wounds were his voice. That was the most psychologically disturbing part of the case for me in the end. George Henda did not view himself as a monster. He viewed himself as someone correcting behavior. The victims were simply people he observed long enough to decide they deserved execution. And the final thing that stayed with me after their arrest was how little it ultimately took for the murders to happen. 4 people died. 4 skulls destroyed by close-range gunfire. 4 bodies left bleeding in parks, while handwritten notes sat beside them in the darkness. All because one man quietly decided he had the right to judge strangers he watched from a distance.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Case Files of Detective Shiela Geathers. We invite you to return and watch the rest of this exciting story when we return later this week with another episode. Have a great evening.